The front door didn't lead outside. It led back into the dust. We thought we were breaking into a ruin, but the ruin was actually breaking into us. How do you escape a house that keeps handing you back your own tragedies, one chair at a time? The opening. The air inside Blackwood Manor didn't smell like decay. It smelled like stagnation, like a breath held for 50 years. Elias, Sarah, and Mark stepped over the threshold, their flashlights cutting through a veil of floating silver dust. They were looking for a thrill, the kind of urban legend adrenaline that washes off with a hot shower. But when Elias turned the brass knob to exit the living room and head into the kitchen, he didn't find a... The heavy oak door of Blackwood Manor groaned, a sound like grinding teeth, as Elias pushed it open. The beam of his flashlight cut through a haze of dust so thick it looked like gray velvet. Behind him, Sarah and Mark stepped in, their boots crunching on broken glass and decades of discarded mail. "See?" Mark whispered, his voice too loud for the oppressive silence. "Just an old house, no cults, no axe murderers, just a lot of bad wallpaper." Sarah didn't laugh. She tightened. The sound of the rocking chair, creak, crack, creak, cut through the silence like a blade. No one moved. The three of them stood huddled near the door they had just emerged from, their flashlights converging on the corner of the room. The mahogany rocking chair was no longer empty. A figure sat there. It was a man, thin and frail, draped in a pale blue hospital gown that looked unnervingly clean against the filthy backdrop of... As the door slammed shut behind them, the atmosphere changed instantly. The clinical smell of the hospital was gone, replaced by the heavy, suffocating scent of stagnant lake water and wet wool. They stood in the center of the room, panting. Elias looked toward the corner. The rocking chair was back to being just a chair, empty, dusty, and still. His grandfather was gone. For a fleeting... They spilled through the doorway, bracing for a splash of lake water, but they hit hard, dry wood instead. The transition was instantaneous. The roar of the flooding water vanished, replaced by a silence so profound it made their ears ring. They scrambled to their feet, gasping for air. Elias immediately checked his boots. They were bone dry. No silt, no weeds. The moment they crossed the threshold, the roar of the previous room didn't stop. It inverted. It became a vacuum of sound that made their eardrums throb painfully. They stumbled into the living room for the 5th time, but the physics of the space were beginning to decay. The air didn't feel like gas anymore. It felt like... The darkness was absolute. After the flashlights exploded, the silence that followed was even more terrifying. A thick, suffocating blanket. Elias scrambled blindly, his hands hitting the rough carpet. Then something cold and clammy. A foot. The drowned boy's foot. "Sarah! Mark! Where are you?" Elias shouted. His voice didn't echo. It died an inch. They tumbled into the room, but the floor was no longer level. The entire living room had tilted at a 15-degree angle, making every step a struggle against a phantom gravity. The sound of their heavy breathing echoed, but it sounded metallic, as if they were trapped inside a giant copper bell. Mark hit the floor hard, his wooden shiv skidding across the tilted carpet and disappearing into the shadows of the corner. As the exit door migrated to the ceiling, the breathing of the iron lung grew louder. It was no longer a mechanical hiss, it was becoming vocal. Each whoosh of the bellows sounded like a collective intake of breath from 1,000 lungs. Elias, Mark, and Sarah stood in a room that felt like the interior of a beating heart. As they scrambled through the ceiling door, they didn't fall upward. Gravity corrected itself with a sickening jolt, slamming them onto a floor that felt soft, like moss over mud. They were back in the living room, but the grand piano was gone. In its place was a monstrous heap. It wasn't just one person. It was a composition of bodies, distant relatives. The rippling mirror acted like a vacuum, pulling Elias's arm into its silver surface, but the rest of his body was anchored by the screaming weight of his friends. The room was no longer a room. It was a pressurized chamber of flesh and wood. Mark was disappearing. The piano mound of bodies had opened. The air in the room was now impossibly thick, smelling of copper and fresh denim. Elias and Sarah lay on the rug, their lungs burning as they struggled to process the silence. The chaos of the previous mound was gone. The room looked deceptively clean, almost staged for an estate sale. Except for the piano. As they squeezed through the cat flap-sized opening, the sensation of floor vanished. They didn't emerge into a room, they emerged onto a wall. Gravity had rotated 90 degrees. Elias and Sarah found themselves standing on the floral wallpaper of the living room's north wall. What should have been the floor was now a... The amber light died the moment they landed. There was no thud this time, only the sound of two bodies hitting something soft and yielding. The room had shrunk to the size of a walk-in closet. The walls were so close that Elias and Sarah were forced to stand chest to chest, their breath mingling in the stagnant air. Where? Elias stepped through the zip line of the wall and into a space that defied human optics. There was no floor, no ceiling, and no walls, only a vast, infinite white desert of light. The sound of the house, the breathing, the screaming, the whispering, was cut off as if by a guillotine. He stood in a silence so heavy it felt... Elias stood on the porch of Blackwood Manor, gasping for air. The night was crisp
and the scent of pine needles replaced the suffocating formaldehyde. He stumbled down the wooden steps, his legs feeling like lead. He didn't look back until his boots hit the gravel of the driveway. "I made it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Sarah, Mark, I'm sorry." He looked at his hands,